Hi, everybody. This presentation deals with augmented reality as an example of a technology that is often integrated into the curriculum in educational environments. And what the presentation sets out to do is to consider two ways of viewing that technology in the way in which it's used, either as object in the world or as simulacrum or simulation. So I'm beginning the presentation essentially with a quotation from T.S. Eliot's Little Gidding, because it applies particularly to the journey that I'd like to take you on during the presentation. We shall not cease from exploration, and the end of all our exploring will be to arrive where we started and know the place for the first time. We'll return to that quotation a little bit later on. So the problem, as I see it, is that technologies as tools for learning are very, very often viewed as objects in the world to be manipulated. And what I mean by that, I suppose, is that technology is often viewed from an instrumentalist perspective, in the sense that students are often encouraged to be able to use technology effectively for the purposes of learning. And so you could argue, I suppose, that to some extent that's an instrumentalist approach or view of the problem. What I am advocating in this particular presentation is that we often fail to consider the relationships between humanity, technology, and the environment. And so what we do is we do consider an instrumentalist discourse, but we don't often engage students in a relational discourse. What I'm going to do in the presentation is I'm going to use augmented reality as an example of such a technology. And I'll try to outline what this discourse might look like. Right, so a good place to begin is a definition. The definition of augmented reality essentially consists of two parts. There is a digital overlay, or if you like, a computer-generated overlay. And this particular overlay is something which is put over or overlaid across reality, or at least a viewer's experience of reality. So what you have is you have a real environment and you have digital information superimposed on that environment. So those are the two really important aspects of the definition of augmented reality. So the questions we're going to be looking at throughout the presentation and that spring from that definition are the following. What makes a real environment? What's the substantive difference between a real environment and an overlay? And lastly, who or what is being augmented? So the first aspect of this is a consideration very briefly of the relationship between technology and the environment. And in examining this relationship, I'm going to compare augmented reality and augmentation to ubiquitous computing. So whereas augmented reality envisages the overlay of digital information on a user's view of the world, ubiquitous computing suggests that computing is embedded in the natural environment, and in a sense, as Weiser says, weaves itself into the fabric of everyday life and becomes indistinguishable from it. So one question we could ask is, where is the site of computation in each of those cases? And the argument would be, presumably, that in the case of augmented reality, the site of computation is the intermediary layer between the viewer or the person and the environment. Whereas if you think about ubiquitous computing, the site of computation is the actual real environment itself. And related to this concept of technology infused in the environment is the concept of everywhere, or the sense in which, if you think about the Internet of Things, the sense in which everyday life is colonized by technology. So if we view the so-called real world from a ubiquitous computing perspective, then one of the questions we could ask is, what then becomes the substantive difference between the digital overlay and the real world? So if the real world is infused with technology, then is there really a difference substantively between that and the digital overlay? So the other point that we'd like to sort of suggest is that it's not only the relationship between technology and the environment that's relevant here, but also the relationship between technology and humanity. So if we go back to the 1960s, at least two authors considered the the relationship between technology and humanity, McLuhan on the one hand and Engelbart on the other. And McLuhan essentially was suggesting that technology is an extension of the human body in some senses. And what he meant by that, for example, is that the motor car, enables us to travel much further than our feet and our legs enable us. And in that sense, the motor car becomes an extension of the legs and the feet. And his argument is that the logical conclusion there is that we translate ourselves into information, into the technological extensions of consciousness. So in a sense, what you have there is humanity colonizing technology to some extent. A similar sort of view is Engelbart's view, where he argues that we should really be considering augmentation from the perspective of the human intellect. And in that sense, he speaks about the human intellect as a system that consists both of our inborn biological human intellect, biologically based human intellect, if you like, but then also those augmentation means that contribute to human intellect, such as artifacts, language, methodology, and training. And Engelbart would argue certainly that artifacts include things like computers and their uses and so forth. So from both of these perspectives, we actually see humanity colonizing technology, or if you like, becoming entwined with technology in various ways. This idea is taken even further by Stiegler in Time and Technics, Part 1 particularly. So what Stiegler argues quite simply is that technics, the concept of technics, incorporates both the organized inorganic matter, by that he means tools or instruments or machines, but also the techniques and associated methods of working that are engaged or involved in its creation and its effective use of those particular objects. So his argument is that if you think about techniques from that perspective, then techniques and humanity become so intertwined and mutually constitutive that it's almost impossible to separate them. And quite simply, that means in modern day environment, if you think about it, think about humanity and you think about technology, then it's quite difficult to separate the two out. They become mutually constitutive. And so this process of development in both spheres and integrated development he calls a process of grammatization. And so this relates to our argument in a very specific way. Process of grammatizations render augmented reality enterprise, as we've defined it earlier, as a bit of an impossibility, because viewed from this perspective, you'll see that humanity and techniques or technology become mutually constitutive processes and therefore constitute a single fabric. They're not actually two different things. They're really part and parcel of the same thing. So we can take this argument a step further. We can say, what is the difference then between augmentation or augmented reality and reality itself? And so Baudrillard comes with an interesting sort of perspective on that in terms of looking at the media environment, where he argues quite simply that when you look at the media environment, abstractions or models actually have no correlative originals or reality associated with it. And so the metaphor that he uses is essentially arguing that the map precedes the territory. And in a sense, I suppose you could argue, his point is that there is no territory to which the map refers. And so what you have is something he calls the precession of simulacra. In other words, simulations existing either in isolation or certainly before there is any concept of original reality. And so what he argues essentially is that when you're dealing with a modern day media environment, there is no way in which the abstractions that you see in the media have an objective correlative in reality. And so what you're left with is entangled orders of simulation. And so an example of this would be Disneyland, for example, which he says encompasses three entangled orders of simulation. Firstly, there are the theme parks themselves that present to the visitors imaginary worlds and forms of simulation. Secondly, there's the sort of warmth and affection amongst people, amongst the crowd in the theme parks. And in a sense, the crowd revels in this concept of the real America. But clearly, when you are ejected into the car park of Disneyland, that disappears automatically. And a third level of simulation, entangled simulation, is the concept that Disneyland is supposed to represent an imaginary world as opposed to the real Los Angeles or the real America. But his argument essentially is that it's very difficult to define what the real Los Angeles or real America is, because that too is a simulation. It's an abstraction, something that's not necessarily based on an original reality. And so therefore he argues that Disneyland really just preserves the appearance of a link between simulation and reality. There is actually no objective correlative to which it refers. Now, the importance of this, I suppose, for our particular perspective on augmented reality is, once again, it brings into question this very supposedly clear differentiation in the definition of augmented reality between the digital overlay and the real world to which it supposedly refers. So clearly, once again, this is an attack on that. So if you look across the various aspects we've looked at so far, if you take technology and the environment, you realize that if the environment is infused with digital technology, then to what extent is the overlay substantively different? You could ask the question. If you look at the relationship between humanity and technology, we could ask whether, in fact, that which is being augmented is it the reality in front of you in theory, or is it humanity that is being augmented, or is it technology that's being augmented from the perspective of Stiegler and others? And then finally, if you look at Baudrillard's argument, the question is, to what extent is there a reality at all? To what extent are we dealing with simulations that are entangled? So, in conclusion, the point of this discussion is to delineate some of the sort of outlines of a discourse that enables us to deal with augmented reality from a broader perspective, one that's not purely instrumentalist, but one that actually is relational, that looks at the relationship between augmented reality or technology on the one hand, humanity and the environment on the other. And the argument that I'm presenting here is essentially this, that if we return to the quotation from T.S. Eliot at the beginning of the presentation, once students and teachers have grappled with this relational aspect of technology, the way in which technology interacts with the environment, not only will they have gained a broader perspective in terms of the way in which technology acts in society, but they will also have a far richer understanding of current debates around things such as artificial intelligence, and more specifically, the really, really important ethical questions that need to be answered in terms of that use of technology. So if we approach the use of technology in education from both an instrumentalist and a relational perspective, what we do is we provide our students and our teachers with a far richer understanding of the way in which technology interacts and in fact is intertwined with society and humanity more broadly. Thank you very much.